The Minister of Pacific Island Affairs, why did the Chief Executive of the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs announce last week that a range of organisations will now be asked to bid for the $4.8 million that was specifically earmarked in this year's budget for the Pacific Economic Development Agency Limited?
Honourable Georgina Tehuhu.
It's my understanding that the Chief Executive of the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs thought that the public may be interested to know that he was inviting tender applications from a number of Pacific agencies and organisations, including the Pacific Education Centre, the Pacific Business Trust, the Village Trust CME Mentoring and the Pacific Economic Development Agency, with the intention of negotiating a package to build skills, qualifications and entrepreneurship among young Pacific people. Clearly, this is a Chief Executive with a keen appreciation of the government's wish and desire to invest in Pacific people and communities to ensure their future success and prosperity.
Supplementary to the Minister, does she now accept that this was a shonky deal from the start, which her ministry confirmed by not endorsing the Pacific Economic Development Agency proposal? And will she now accept that this was an attempt to use public money for political advantage?
The Honourable Georgina Tehuhu.
Speaker, no, I don't accept any of those assertions, Mr. Speaker. This was a budget appropriation made on the basis of the economic development needs of Pacific people in the Auckland region. Certainly the proposals put forward by the Pacific Economic Development Agency coincided with the government's appreciation that there needed to be a real focus on young Pacific adults who were without skills and training. From the government's perspective, what is important is that we have appropriated new money, in fact the largest single injection of funding into the Ministry of Pacific Island Affairs in 10 years, to help some of the most underprivileged and vulnerable members in the community, and I would have thought that that member would have applauded the government's initiative.
Sir William Seo.
Supplementary to the Minister. Why is she so willing to still risk $4.8 million of taxpayer funds by still including Peter in the tender process announced, when her own ministry has warned this private company has not delivered on any projects of note, is untested and unproven in the ability to deliver on projects of this scale?
Honourable Georgina Tehuhu.
Mr. Speaker, as the member knows, the appropriation was always subject to the successful completion of a purchase agreement with the Pacific Economic Development Agency. In the meantime, the Chief Executive has now decided to tender the funding out, and as we have previously said, decisions around purchase agreements are a matter for officials.
Supplementary.
Sir William Seo.
Will she tell Parliament who should be held accountable for the shambolic Peter affair? A, herself as responsible minister. B, Mr. English, who named Peter as his preferred provider. And C, Mr. Key, who said in written answer 12758 that he met with Pesita Sam Lotu-Inga, Michael Jones and Bainga Tuinga Mala at the Columbus Cafe in June 2009, but cannot recollect if J.R. Pereira was there or whether they discussed funding at all or not. Or D, all of the above.
Order. I'm on my feet and there will be silence. I just ask members, please, to think a little about the questions they're asking. I listened to a question asked a moment ago that contained a derogatory statement in it, and now this question contains, the question didn't need to contain the assertion that this was a shambolic affair. Now, those sort of questions are totally outside standing orders and shouldn't be allowed. Now, what do I do as Speaker? And the question went on and on and on and inserted all sorts of stuff into the question, and it's simply not good enough. I've insisted on ministers answering straight questions. I've given the opposition huge power through that. And to throw it away with meaningless political statements is a tragedy for this House. And so, look, I invite Sir William Seo to re-ask his question in an intelligible way, to cut out the assertions about what he might think of a program, because that's irrelevant to a question and outside standing orders. But to ask a question, the Minister can answer. Suet Williams-Seow. Order. I say the government benches show some courtesy.
Supplementary then to the Minister. Will she tell Parliament who should be held accountable for the U-turn of this government on the Peter affair?
The Honourable Georgina Tehuhu.
Mr. Speaker, I don't accept the premise that there is a U-turn. There is an appropriation of taxpayers' money here that this government appropriated to improve the well-being of young Pacific people. And that is something that government, that party in government, did not do in their 10 years in government, and that member should be ashamed of it.
Point of order, Honourable Darren
Mr.
Hughes.
Speaker, there's been a lot of sermonising today about the language used by opposition members in their questions. That Minister just screamed across the House at my colleague. He should be ashamed of himself. Now, he put down a question on an issue he's taken up in this Parliament over several days. This is an issue that's very close to the heart of my colleague and his constituents. His commitment to the issue is clear. He's been asking the question of this Minister, and instead he gets
order,
personal
there won't
abuse.
be interjections.
Well, if Tau Henare would mind
no order.
on points of order.
I've heard the member. The member should know that if a question alleges a government has done a U-turn, they're likely to get a fairly strong response from the government, because governments don't like being accused of having done U-turns, like it or not. Now, that's the reality. I just think members should think about the questions they're asking. If they don't want fairly robust responses, it's to accuse a minister of having done a U-turn is invariably going to elicit a response from them. But I would accept, though, that ministers shouldn't in any way make a personal attack on the questioner. And members will note today I've pulled up several ministers who I feel have made personal attacks on questioners. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, just to seek clarification, Mr. Speaker, we've heard your messages about asking straight questions. But, Mr. Speaker, the implication of your latest ruling, sir, is that we are required to ask the questions that the government would like to hear in order to avoid personal abuse. And sure,
order.
That cannot
order.
Be,
if the members would
like,
I'm very happy to run questions 101 for members on how to ask tough questions, because as a minister, I've probably answered as many questions in this House as any other person, and I've certainly asked probably more questions than any other member of this House. And I'm very happy to assist members if they want to actually have a little assistance on how to ask a tough question. But it's not that difficult, and we're not going to waste more time on it right now. Question number, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I was challenged before on whether my quote was correct on the Prime Minister saying tax and consumption at a relatively low rate. I now seek leave of the House to table the document where he said that. This is, by the way, his statement to Parliament.
Well, if the Parliament already has the statement, there's absolutely no need for that to be tabled. Order. There's absolutely no need to table it whatsoever. It's just wasting time of the House. Order. Another point of order has been called, but I warn members my patience is wearing thin. Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Sir, I ask you to simply reflect on a matter I raised with you, which has been illustrated today. I raised it with you a couple of weeks ago. Without wishing to take the time of the House, these matters, sir, could be well resolved if you were to revisit, sir, your ruling in respect of tabling public documents, because the simple dilemma that's been placed before the House today is one of who do we believe, right, without getting into the detail. Now, the member rose to table yes, a document...
Order. I've heard sufficient from the member. I'm not about to revisit that decision. The standing orders around tabling documents are very simple. Documents where leave is sought to table documents is provide information for the House. Trying to score points of order that I'm right and you are wrong is not the purpose of tabling documents. If members don't have the intellect to actually ask the hard question, to show through the questioning, to put the minister on the spot, to embarrass the minister, then they shouldn't be a member of this House if they don't have that intellect, and shouldn't waste time with the Honourable Tau Henare will be silent while I'm on my feet. And simply making a political statement by way of a supplementary question and then seeking leave to table a document is not what question time's about. Point of order, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove. And if he